welcome, welcome. What an event. This has been really cool. So really glad that everybody has been able to make it out. And Meet Magento is special in our ecosystem, and even more special is this relationship with Adobe that I'm sure everyone here is wanting to hear more about. So welcome, Matt. Matt, you're the head of developer ecosystem for Adobe.
I am.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? So let me just start off by saying what that means is a lot more interesting today than it was a year ago. And that has everything to do with Magento, sincerely. When we started talking about working with Magento, I was over the moon happy because, so at Adobe has actually had a long, storied, sometimes sad story, sometimes positive story with developers. You have things like Flex, going all the way back to Macromedia. And so there is some history there, but of more recent vintage, it's been our work with Adobe Experience Manager, so our content management system developers, AEM developers, and a range of others. But all of those are, maybe in the case of AEM, open ecosystem sort of work, but not open source. And my background is all in open source. So Magento brought that blood and DNA into Adobe in force, and it's just been fantastic. So I oversee all of the work that we do with our various developer communities across the company.
And open source is an important role at Adobe?
It has become so, but again, I would say that's of somewhat recent vintage. Now, my immediate manager likes to remind me that 10-ish years ago, when I was at this little open source content management company, Alfresco, that we actually did a partnership with Adobe at the time, and he likes to remind me, he said, Matt, I was into open source before open source was cool. And it's like, actually, open source was cool further back than 10 years ago. But so we have had a history with open source. Like any company, the vast majority, I would say 60% plus of any of our proprietary products are open source under the hood. But we haven't really done much with the outside community. We have a range of contributors, several hundred people who regularly contribute to a variety of open source projects. But I would say that it hadn't really become part of the standard operating procedure. We contribute to open source projects as a company. We bless that work that our employees are doing. About a year or so ago, and I might be fortuitously pinpointing it at that time because that's when I took on the job, it started to change. It actually started a little bit before that with David Nuschler. We've had pockets of the company, like AEM that I mentioned before, where they've been heavily involved in open source for the last 10 plus years, mostly on the Apache side. But most haven't. As a company, though, certainly in the last year, probably longer, a little bit longer than that, the company has been making a concerted effort to, okay, what do we need to do to lower the bar to our employees contributing? What do we need to do to make it easier for them to contribute, not just to the projects that are of interest to us commercially as a company, but also making it easier for our employees to just contribute more to projects that they find interesting, even if it's on company time. So that's been a somewhat recent shift, but it's a shift that's accelerating rapidly, really fast. That's accelerated much faster than I had expected. We measured a year ago, and all of these measurements are somewhat imperfect, but we measured the percentage of our employees and then the percentage of our engineers that actively contribute to open source projects. And a year ago, we were, of big companies, we were ranked maybe, I think it was 38. Today we're ranked 16th, and if you take percentage of engineers contributing, then I think we're ranked 11th. And if IBM buys anybody else, I think we kind of became number 10 without having to do anything, just because two of those companies merged together. But
well, and to that point, IBM just acquired Red Hat.
Yeah.
So that's quite an acquisition in the open source space, but it's not the first. And Magento's coming into Adobe is another big open source acquisition. I'm sure there are others. You're calling 2018 the year of open source.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how you see open source playing a role in enterprise.
Well, so it's interesting with the IBM acquisition of Red Hat. I think I tallied it up at 55 billion or so, and I saw another report from somebody who probably had more time to do it. I think it was CNBC or somebody was reporting that the number is actually 58 billion spent on open source companies in 2018.
This year alone.
Which is amazing. And I think, so if you look at it, I've got to be careful because this probably will get out someplace. But
no, these guys would never share anything.
No. Okay, good.
Outside this room.
We're all under
it's very
NDA,
intimate
right?
here.
If you look at, you ask the question, and this is just speculation, but you ask the question, why would IBM spend 30% of its market cap on this company an open source company? And it's, I mean, you can make all the arguments about hybrid. They're trying to buy their way into cloud and stuff, but really it's about open source at its heart. The only reason that Red Hat is interesting is because of open source. And if you look at, well, so why did Adobe acquire Magento? And part of it is absolutely we needed a strong commerce play, but it's because of the open source element of Magento. When in the 11 a.m. session talking about Magento 2.3, the thing that impressed me most in that session was, and this was developed, I'm trying to remember the
multi-source inventory.
Multi-source inventory was developed in concert with the community, and that's what makes Magento so interesting. So Adobe comes in and says, fantastic product, fantastic. Oh, and by the way, the reason it's a fantastic product is there's this fantastic community behind it. And I think we're going to see it more and more of that as companies wake up to they already know from the last few years that the only really interesting data infrastructure out there is open source. Whether it started with Hadoop and it became Spark and Kafka and all these other things. But that's where the action is for innovative code. And now it's moving into machine learning and AI, and you say, well, where's the interesting stuff? It's TensorFlow and these other things. So companies are waking up to that and saying, if I want to be a participant, if I want to be taken credibly in the modern enterprise, it has to be open source. And so at Adobe right now, this is, again, it hasn't gone throughout all across the company as, it hasn't sunk in as deeply across the company, but there are pockets, significant pockets, where we're looking at the way that we would have done something 2 years ago without blinking, and machine learning and AI is one of them, and we're saying, maybe this should be open source. And that conversation would not have happened 2 years ago, but it's the way the industry is going is forcing change at Adobe, even for those people who have made their careers on selling proprietary software. It's forcing everyone to kind of say, well, maybe I'm doing it wrong.
You can be open source without being community-centric. We've seen that a lot.
I have worked for those companies.
So I think that
companies,
the real differential in our community, in the Magento community, is the community. It's the people. And there are critics or cynics that might say that open sourcing product development is an unfair use of the community's time and talent. How do you respond to those types of critics and say that it's not just about value prop in an acquisition, that the community helps inspire what Adobe wants to be on the enterprise side of the business?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think Magento, like anyone, you get something and you become spoiled by riches, and Magento is a community spoiled by riches. You don't, as an outsider coming in, I think that in sign language means something, and I'm worried about what signal I just sent out to the world. outsider coming in, yes, the headline number, I think it's now 60% of the core Magento product is, or project, whichever word you prefer, it comes from the community. And you're right, one way of looking at that is, oh, Magento Inc. is strip mining, or now Adobe, you're strip mining the community for value. You're loading us up, we're your indentured servants. And that is a extraordinarily pessimistic way of looking at an amazing phenomenon that benefits everybody. Because that code that the community is developing, yes, Magento goes off and makes use of it, but I could name 100 companies, probably represented, many of them represented here, that also go off and make money from Magento, either as a partner or not even as a partner.
Yeah.
So it's just this amazing value creation community, and I think it's raising, what is it, the rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah.
And as near as I can tell in the Magento community, the boats are being lifted, and it's not just Magento. That's the sign of a really bad community where you've got one rich feudal lord sitting up making money from the serfs, and that's just simply not the case with Magento. Both because I know what the revenue of Magento is, which is it's great and it's growing, but I also know or have ballpark numbers on the companies around Magento who are making a lot of money from it. And the amazing thing about Magento too, and this is something that Adobe is trying to work on, because we for years have said, and I'm speaking more of the digital marketing side, because the digital media side, Creative Cloud, Photoshop, et cetera, has long had a small to medium-sized enterprise or an individual buyer. On the digital marketing side, we haven't, but have wanted to figure out how to work with that market. And Magento has shown the way with these larger enterprises that use Magento, smaller enterprises, small agencies, smaller system integrators, large system integrators. It's again, we are spoiled for riches in the Magento community. And maybe if you've been living in Magento land for a long time, I would advise you to go take a walk over to my previous company, MongoDB, or take a walk over to, name your open source project, commercial or otherwise. And I guarantee no one has it as good as you. No one has it this good.
Yeah, that we can get excited about that.
And you don't have to believe me. Just go take a look at any other open source project, especially if there's a company that's the primary developer. And for most of these larger projects that are successful, there tends to be a company there because somebody has to pay the developers to do it. And no community on this planet operates the way that Magento does with as much value sharing. I don't want to talk about money so much because it's not just about money, but I'm making that point because to what you said earlier about this criticism that Magento is unfairly benefiting from it.
Yeah, well, I think then you would have to, by extension, say, and then merchants unfairly benefit, and system integrators unfairly benefit, and I can buy more sneakers because I unfairly benefit, and we all benefit.
I think you probably should stop buying sneakers.
Yeah, I think so.
If we're honest.
Especially these. What's really interesting is I look outside of Magento, Matt, to your point, and it's not just Magento in the retail or merchant enabling ecosystem that's starting to see others give back. I look at what Walmart is doing to invest in Node.js, and I look at what other retail brands are starting to put back into open source. I run a podcast called Future Commerce. We just had Steve Conine, who's the co-founder of Wayfair, and they're contributing in huge quantities back to machine learning, AI, and machine vision open source projects on the Python side. Retailers that are outsized, that are benefiting from open source, are starting to give back too. So it's not just about the developer ecosystem, it's also about the merchant ecosystem. From Adobe's side, that's compelling, right? That's compelling in that you're seeing a trend not just in one ecosystem, but it's across, or not to put words in your mouth. Is that compelling to Adobe to say that it's not just happening in one place, it's kind of happening this is the trend that we're all sort of falling toward.
It is compelling, but the thing is, it needs to be more compelling. So Wayfair is still probably more the exception to the rule, which the rule still is, hey, there's open source. That means free. That means that I can get a lot of value and give basically nothing back. And the problem with that sort of mentality is that you actually get far less by not contributing back than if your developers, or not just developers, but I'll say developers are actively contributing back. They learn the software better. They develop new skills. They develop the bonds between. I mean, so people here, and many of you will know Ben, will spend time out in the hallway talking with people. That sort of interaction, that sort of feedback that goes back into the product, or that sort of feedback where you learn something new about how Magento could be used, you only get that if you participate. So somebody who's just taking and not giving anything back, they get a certain amount of value, but they get far less than they would if they actually contributed. And Harvard Business Review recently it was published in Harvard Business Review, this study that I think it was something like 100% more value derived from participating in open source projects than if you just are a net consumer of that project. So that's exciting for Adobe, but that's as we participate more in projects. So I'm thinking now, I'm putting myself in the Wayfair person's shoes. As we participate more, we're getting more value from those projects. But also just industry-wide, think of how much crappy software is redeveloped, how many wheels are reinvented over and over and over again by individual companies that are all building the exact same things. Whereas if we would come together and work on a common commerce platform like Magento, or work on a common operating system like Linux, suddenly it becomes better for everyone, but it also becomes better for you, because then you can go spend your time on that last mile of innovation or whatever that makes you truly different as a retailer, or as, name your business. And that's exciting to us at Adobe, because we're finally, the light bulb has gone off at a corporate level that we need to be more involved in these sorts of things, and we have this perfect laboratory of a company and a community that I think is doing it really well. So we have a great example that we can learn from. And my job, you asked before what my job is, part of my job is taking what's great about Magento and teaching other product groups about the value that they could have if they would open up. And we're going to do that little by little. It's not, change is hard, but we're already seeing people say, hey, why shouldn't my SDK be open source? We're like, that's a good question. And they're increasingly coming back and saying, hey, we're going to open source this. And guess what? The first few things, most of you, probably none of you, are going to be interested in what comes out of that. But those are the baby steps that will get us to become a more participatory company, participating company.
You mentioned before, not to comment back on Red Hat, but if there's a criticism of Red Hat buying, or of IBM buying into cloud ecosystem with an acquisition, is there a criticism of Adobe buying into commerce and by buying into this ecosystem? And how do you create like a cohesive ecosystem of solutions through acquisitions? Like Marketo just came in through Adobe. Give me a little bit of a taste of what you think the future looks like and how you stitch those together.
So we have been actually working in earnest for maybe the last 2 years on building out the Adobe Experience Platform. It hasn't always been called that, so I had to make sure that I had the branding right for right now. Adobe Experience Platform, which is kind of a platform that allows data and content to flow between the different solutions. And we will be, I don't think I'm giving away anything now, but we will be demonstrating the first few services that will be available to developers, people outside of Adobe, in the spring timeframe. If you're interested, we could probably open up some access to that now, but that will be technically the way that the products start to speak to each other better than they have in the past. And Magento's part of that. Actually, and one of the things that's exciting about this is that Magento has already influenced the way that we do that. So there's this thing called the CIF, or Commerce Integration Framework, that's built on OpenWhisk, or our product Runtime, our instantiation of OpenWhisk. So it's built on open source. The plan is to make it open source, so the integration framework will be open source, and to start doing more of these integrations. So that core, it's a bad analogy, but river of data and content that customers and developers can tap into, that will be, that's the experience platform. But the way that we make it extensible is absolutely through open source that we're learning from Magento. And I think, and maybe the way that I would now, but having said that, we don't feel like we have 100% the right way to do it, the right way, trademark sign, and we really need feedback for it. So actually, a developer in the Magento community tweeted at me, has also made my life more interesting. Since the acquisition, I've been more active on Twitter, not always in ways that I wanted to be, but he said, hey, I'd like to get access to AEM, Adobe Experience Manager, and I want to see if I can, like, funky ways that I can connect it to Magento. I said, sure. So I gave him access, and it's those sorts of conversations, even at the individual level of one random developer and one random Adobe product, like kicking the tires, trying to make things work. That's the way that I think that this community moves forward. It's certainly the way that Adobe will move forward. It won't be by some grand design that Adobe will get up on stage and announce the next big thing. That's how we've done it in the past. We recognize that, like I said, the new model of innovation, it's not a new model for the industry, for open source developers, but it's a new model for companies like Adobe to think about, oh wait, there may be some big reveal on stage, but it should reflect all the work that's been happening in public GitHub repositories that for those interested, they could be watching it all along. So if you want to see the future of AEM, go to Project Helix, which is being 100% open source developed right now in the wide open.
Wow.
It's kind of cool.
So you touched on Twitter. I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of broach the topic and ask you, you're coming in from the outside, so you have this benefit of not having been engaged with Magento over the last 10 years. It's something I'm constantly having to re-educate myself or remind myself about, which is I've been around this community for a decade, and so I see it a certain way. I want to be aware that there are people that are uninitiated that are coming into the Magento community every day. What is your take, or how can we be better stewards of those that are newly entering into our community as someone who's recently become engaged both online and offline with who Magento is and the people that make it work?
Maybe the way I would answer that is by saying that there are the benefit and the risk of a community like Magento is you have certain public faces that everybody kind of knows. Like I could rattle off a few names of people that I've seen of this. I've been to a few Magento conferences now, and the same people are not everybody's the same, but there are a few familiar faces at each one. Now that's a strength in that it's a comfortable community. People know each other, at least at a certain level. There are people that are very familiar with each other. It's also potentially a risk in that if you're not one of those cool kids that everybody knows, then you kind of walk into the room and there's this group of people kind of talking to each other because they all know each other. And then if you're me, because I'm not all that social anyway, you're like, oh, it's a party for those people to hang out, and then I'm gonna leave and go back to my hotel room, which is usually what I do anyway. So this is no indictment of the Magento community. But I think there's that risk that we were talking earlier about language that we use. I know what an SI is, but not everybody does. And so if somebody does make it up into that conversation, we're talking about SIs and AOV and like all these other terms that people on the inner circle may know what that means, or pull requests and things like this, then great. But but to make it a welcoming community, I think we always have to assume that if there are 315,000 Magento developers today, which I think is the number that I saw most recently, I think success looks like 3 million Magento developers or 30 million Magento developers. Like, we shouldn't cap it, and we should do those things that make it more and more approachable for other people. And part of that is the way that we interact with each other. And I've found the Magento community so far on Twitter and elsewhere to be overwhelmingly positive and welcoming. Because here I was like, I'm sure in some ways I'm kind of like the idea that I might be viewed as a corporate overlord, because it makes me think that maybe I'm more powerful than I am, where I can't even get my kids to do what I want them to do. But I'm sure that coming in, like, I'm not sure if anybody wanted to talk to me, but immediately lots of people started talking to me, and I felt really good. I felt welcomed. And if everybody gets some version of that treatment, then that 315,000 goes to 3 million, and everybody's on that inner circle, the cool kids, and that to me looks like success.
It's being welcoming and inviting, but also we need to be aware that we have broader influence now today more than ever with Adobe's ownership of Magento, and our reach could be much broader than we could ever dream. And I think that's just great advice. Anything else that you want to add? What do you think the next few years looks like, and what can we do to help understand the Adobe ecosystem a little better? Are there solutions out there that we should be keeping our eye on that might be differential for retailers?
Yeah, well, I mean, so we've announced those first integrations with Adobe Experience Manager, Target for personalization, Launch, our tag management solution. But I think, to me, what I hope the future looks like is the Magento community obviously continuing to be interested in Magento, and then any adjacencies. Like, I would say that AEM should be an interesting adjacency, and if it's not a fit, or if you look at it and you say, this looks like a big company crap software, then recognize Adobe has the interest in making it fit Magento. I know there was early on this idea that, Adobe's going to come in, they serve large enterprises, they're going to take Magento and focus on large enterprises. And yes, we are. And we want to figure out how to work better with the small to medium-sized enterprise market and the various partners that work in that area. So we need your help. And if there are ways, like, if it's one thing for me to say we need your help, we can do customer advisory board sort of thing. I need to hear the sorts of things that you want us to do to make Adobe more permeable to feedback. And because we want it. We may not know exactly how to do that today, but if you will tell us, and maybe there are already established ways that Magento does this, that we can just embrace what you've already done. Well, tell me what those things are, and then let's do them. So again, I hope the next few years is Magento as a immediate company and as a community teaching Adobe how to be good open source citizens. It is in your interest, I think, and it's definitely in our interest, and we need your help.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Matt.
Thanks,
thank you for your time, and this has been such a pleasure. Shannon, do we have a moment for questions?
We do. That's why I'm standing.
Very good.
So, got Matt Asay from Adobe, Phil Jackson from Something Digital. Who would like to have the first question? All right.
Him.
Karen, could you not sit
Karen
a little
Baker.
closer?
Karen Baker from Shipper HQ.
While you're walking back there, was that Karen? Sorry, I heard a me in it. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello. I actually wrote this down. I've never done that before. How do you feel about the pay-to-play software and service providers that are jumping on the backs of a community that's actively built and championed Magento to where it is today and is still doing so? Do you have any plans to create a more level playing field and champion at a business level those that support you? Is Magento playing fair here?
I think that's a question for you, Philip.
Yeah. It's probably
First of all, I didn't
for
know
you.
that you were British. Who's your football club, or do you have one?
I'm too busy for football.
Oh, well, at least you didn't say Spurs. Then we would have been enemies. So the problem, I have some difficulty answering that, not because I'm intentionally going to be evasive, but because I actually am not as familiar with the problem that you've outlined. You clearly are very, very familiar with something, but maybe I'd ask the follow-up question. When you say the pay-to-play providers, what do you mean? And I may be stepping in something. I should look down at Ben and he'll either...
We can talk about it afterwards. It's fine.
Okay.
If I could elucidate on one thing I think is important, Karen has a history of being sort of one of those storied module vendors who had built a very successful plugin company with deployed software into Magento and pivoted into software as a service. And I think what I think some of the subtext might be is that our ecosystem still needs both. Our ecosystem still needs open access to both. And our ecosystem would probably be poorer if access to one or both of those types of solutions were only available through an extension marketplace that requires partnership to access.
I think that is a longer conversation. So first of all, I don't think I would disagree with anything that you said in response, but I would like to understand it more. So Karen, if we can talk later, I would love to hear it. I'd love to hear the concerns in more detail.
Just make sure your partnership's up to date before you talk to him. Just kidding.
And I'll be honest, some of these things, like me coming into it, I shouldn't say anything because I'm going to get the Magento folks in trouble too. I came from a background of working before Adobe exclusively for open source startups. And I have always hated, even at Adobe, I have always hated any paid partnership. I shouldn't say that, but I just think that the value that you should derive in a community is through, if you're selling software, you sell more software. So I kind of hate pay to play, but that's me speaking as an individual. And I don't even know what Magento does on this, so I need you to tell me, and maybe I'm going to hate what Magento does, just speaking honestly.
I'll tell you what, guys, if you're going to do a mic drop, let me know. I'll bring it to you.
Okay.
Okay? Who's got the next question? Once in a lifetime opportunity, or at least until Imagine.
Nobody? Are you serious?
No one?
Oh, Yissy, down here.
Aha, there we go. Half the day is spent with me finding the audience.
So are there any plans to make a connection between the Adobe Creative Cloud and Magento?
So absolutely. Short answer is yes. The longer answer is, and I've actually talked about this with Ben, the longer answer is we're still trying to figure out what that should look like. And so again, that's where community feedback of, ooh, wouldn't it be cool if I could output something from Illustrator or whatever straight into Magento. It's figuring out what the right workflows are, what people would actually care about. That's more the question for us than do we want to do it. The answer is we want to do it, but it's so maybe this is a conversation that we need to have, and then with others as to what that should look like.
There was an interesting proof of concept demo that I saw at Adobe Max, which is their creative conference in LA a couple weeks ago. And people were taking Adobe Dimension, sort of 3D models, and importing them directly into other content management solutions with AR experiences. And I imagine if you're using that in content in WordPress and you're doing that in other places, it just makes sense to try to do that in commerce as well. That's really cool.
What's one thing that, if I'm a member of the Magento community, what's one thing I can do in the next is it week, month to help show Adobe the path forward?
Maybe I think much of it comes back to what is it that the community is most interested in. And when I say community, I know that can be kind of this nebulous thing. What is Karen Baker interested in doing? What is Yisa interested in doing? Sorry, now I'm like illustrating this cool kid problem. These just happen to be the names that I know. I'll say, what is Susan? Actually, I think that's also a cool kid. I was just going to make up a name, but then I realized it's not a made-up name. I was thinking, all right, what is X, person X out in the audience? What is she interested in? I think, if nothing, I think that's the most important thing to do, is to figure out the communication mechanism to get that insight in. And honestly, I don't know, but I would love, I know that Magento has ways of doing this. I know that on the community engineering side with Max, that there are established ways of doing that. And so maybe, Ben, this is something for us to talk about, is you to walk me through how does Magento do it today in all aspects. I know I have pockets of that understanding, but how can we take that feedback in? And if anybody else has other ideas, either email me, masay@adobe, or tweet at me if you know my Twitter handle. But let's start that conversation, because that's probably the thing more than anything else, is figuring out how to establish that communication mechanism, because everything else will flow well from that, I think.
You guys field one more?
One more.
Fantastic. Who wants the last question? Anyone, a brave soul who will be remembered forever? No one? Aha, and it would be the farthest chair in the back. Oh yeah, feel the burn. Here it comes.
Quick and easy question for you, and you might not know the answer to this one, but do you see Magento and Adobe Sensei getting integrated at some point?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear it.
Do you see Adobe Sensei and Magento being integrated at some point sooner than later?
Sensei?
Oh, yes. So short answer is yes. In fact, I've seen those conversations going back and forth. So, sorry, I should back up, since we don't want to have a cool kid conversation. Adobe Sensei is how we refer to machine learning and AI within Adobe. It's our platform for that. And I have seen conversations going back and forth between Ram, head of engineering at Magento, and Scott Prevost, our head of Sensei at Adobe. In terms of timing, I suspect there'll be something by Summit, which is our big event in, I think it's in March or April next year. That's kind of the target of when I would expect to see something. And then hopefully after that, so one thing that I don't like about Adobe is we're very event-driven. And by that, I don't mean software event-driven. I mean events like Max. He mentioned Max. Max and Summit are our two big events. And everything like kind of is geared around those. So I'm sure, just because that's how we've done business in the past, that will be the first initial step. What I hope is that we'll then see a more iterative series of announcements, and I don't even like announcements, because that indicates a one-way communication. And that Sensei group, Scott Prevost in particular, has been one that says we want to be more open source friendly. We want to work in an open source manner. So I'm actually working with Scott right now to improve on that. So again, I would expect that we'll see something by Summit, but my hope is that after that, you'll see it in the repo, GitHub repo.